Okay, people may be still trickling in, but we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you everyone for being here. My name is Lillian Patil. I am the Senior Analyst of State and Local Budgets here at the Fines and Fees Justice Center, where we work to end government practices of generating revenue off the backs of people who interact with the criminal legal system through the imposition of unjust and excessive fines and fees. I'm really happy to be here with you today to present the third of our budget webinar series. This episode is going to be on following the money, finding fine and fee revenue streams, which is the most often asked question I get in my role of providing technical assistance to our state FFJC teams and partner advocate groups around the country who are working at the state or local level to enact fine and fee reforms in their jurisdictions. I constantly hear when I provide this technical support that the biggest need is often, how do we follow the money? How do we find where the collections from money collected from these fines and fees that we want to eliminate is going, figure out how much of it there is, and figure out what the impact will be if we eliminate it. So that's what we're going to focus on today. And just a quick reminder before we get started, we are recording this webinar, and afterwards we will put it up on our FFJC website for free access, so you can access it at any time. And then some of the concepts that we'll go over are some of the basic budgeting concepts are covered in our previous two episodes in our budget webinar series. The first on how to read a budget book, the second on how to analyze a fiscal note, and you can also access those for free anytime on our FFJC website. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started. And as we go through this webinar and as we go through the slides, please feel free to use the question and answer box that you see there to type in any questions that you may have. I'll try and catch them as we go along, but if we don't, we will make sure to reserve some time at the end for questions. So today's goals, we're going to first start off just talking about the importance of following the money when trying to enact fines and fees reforms, and why it's so difficult often to do so. And then we're really going to get into some concrete nitty-gritty of what kind of processes and steps and tasks can you do on your own to look for fine and fee revenue in your own jurisdiction and in your own budget documents. I always like to illustrate the concepts we talk about in these webinars with real-world examples. So today we'll be looking at an example from New York, and I'll be talking a little bit about the work that I have done with our FFJC New York team and partner advocates in New York on the No Price on Justice campaign to eliminate mandatory court fees, and our work over the last year following the money and honing in on fiscal impact for that campaign. I'm also really happy that we have Antonia Jeffrey here today, who is our New York State Director here at FFJC, and she's going to hop on to talk in a little bit about how this work of following the revenue and that sort of technical work then played into and impacts the overall strategy, narrative, and messaging work on the overall campaign. And then we'll make sure to leave some time at the end for questions. So in starting this conversation about following the money, I first want to just acknowledge that finding any revenue stream in budgets, but particularly fine and fee revenue streams, is really hard. And that is for a number of reasons. One of the biggest ones being that for a fine or fee that is assessed and then collected from people who are interacting with the criminal legal system, that revenue, even if it's a very small amount of money, often can go to many different places, many different funds, many different agencies, sometimes in multiple different jurisdictions. And that all totally depends on how statute rights sets up the collection and distribution of a particular fine or fee, and how the court system in that particular jurisdiction is set up. So whether it's a unified court system where all fines and fees revenue goes straight to the state, whether it's really decentralized, where some pieces of the fine and fee collection stays at the very hyper local level, some goes up to the state, gets transferred back to local. It can all just really depend, and it can get really messy because for each different jurisdiction or each different agency that parts of a fine or fee are going through, that just increases the number of places that you have to look and then find that fine and fee revenue to understand how much is being collected here, there, and then add them all together to understand the overall picture of how much a government is collecting and is dependent upon that fine or fee for its operations. And then we also, of course, know that fine and fee revenue reporting data is often lacking in many, many state and local jurisdictions, which is what we're talking about here today. We're not actually going to touch federal budget or federal fine or fee reporting. We're going to be looking specifically at the state and local levels. And so in these jurisdictions, oftentimes revenue is not only really hard to find, but if you can find it, it's really limited. Sometimes it's not public. Sometimes it doesn't even exist in the first place. And sometimes this can be intentional on the part of governments, but I think more often than that, it's this sort of unintentional, passive lack of data or lack of data systems talking to each other, because there are often so many different agencies and people and offices involved in the collection of fines and fees. And then again, that revenue can get transferred to so many different parts of the jurisdiction or government. And what are often decades old government data systems or software systems don't necessarily talk to each other enough to see a clear reporting of where each dollar is going and where its final destination and use once it gets to that final destination is. Sometimes that's just not public information, but sometimes it's not even internal reporting that's done. And so even people in the government, in the controller's office, for example, may not have the ability to pull really detailed data that shows that clear picture of the revenue path. And then even when we can find that clear picture, often it's still not as useful as we'd like it to be, because the revenue reporting for fines and fee revenue, particularly court fines and fees revenue, is often aggregated into a broader budget line. And an example is at the federal level, how the census reports on fines and fees is including of fees, fines, and civil asset forfeitures. And it's impossible to break apart those pieces from one another. So if you're particularly interested in just fines and fees, but not forfeitures, or you want to look at a particular fine or fee in your jurisdiction, you're not going to be able to pull that apart from the rest of that broader budget line. So it can be hard to know what to attribute trends and like total magnitude of what the numbers are showing to the particular fine or fee that you're looking at. So for all these reasons, and many more, when you go and try to track the money for yourself and track down all the different places that fine and fee revenue may be to get the whole picture of the revenue path, it can start to make your head swim and kind of make it feel like the task is something like this flowchart, which actually has nothing to do with fines and fees at all, but the sort of really complicated nature and messy nature of this flowchart, I think accurately symbolizes how it can often feel to look for fines and fees revenue in budgets or in your local or state jurisdiction, because of all these factors that complicate things. But today we're going to try and simplify this picture and talk about some very concrete tips and tricks to kind of like unwork all these lines and come up with a clearer and simpler revenue path. So if it's so hard to do, why do we always try and do it? If you've joined this webinar, you're probably very familiar with the bullet points on this page, which is why it's so important to still try and track the revenue and follow the money in order to engage in a successful fine or fee reform campaign, to either include fine or fee legislation that eliminates or reforms a fine and fee, or include it as part of a budget. And that's because in order to run a successful campaign and convince legislators to follow through on voting for a fine or fee reform or elimination in the budget, you often have to be able to clearly explain not only why this particular fine or fee is really harmful for community, for the people who owe them, for the people who are being disproportionately impacted and pushed deeper and deeper into poverty because of the fine or fee, but you also often need to be able to show that the fine or fee stream that's being currently used as part of funding overall budget operations is not good for the government. It's not good for people, and it's not good for the budget. It is not a fiscally responsible way to build a budget. And you can only really show that if you're able to get some sense of how much money is coming into the government and into the budget through collection of whatever fine or fee you're looking at, and what is that money being used for? Is it being used at all? And so some important factors that you want to be able to show through following the money is, one, to be able to just get some sort of price point around what will happen if your reform is passed and a fine or fee is changed or eliminated. I'm sure we all know that these reforms almost always need a fiscal note to move forward as pieces of legislation. And if they're being included as part of a budget amendment or in a budget proposal, you're going to need some sort of number that can be programmed into the budget to represent how the revenue structure of the budget will change once you eliminate a particular fine or fee. And if you don't have any sense of that, like if people from in the government or legislators say to you, like, we have no idea, we have no way to track this money, so we don't know how dependent we are on it, so it's just kind of a non-starter. That can be something that causes a piece of legislation to get really stuck in the budget process or in a budget and finance committee process and stop it from moving forward. So successfully being able to see the revenue path can help you overcome that obstacle. Also, it's really important and really powerful to not be able to only say at this moment in time or in the most recent year, here's how much money was collected and brought in. But also being able to say, and here is how that story of government dependency on this finer fee has changed over time. And depending on what the numbers are showing, you can tell a powerful story to legislators and through your advocacy messaging about, again, why this finer fee is bad for government, bad for the budget. So for example, if you're able to get the previous 5 years of collection magnitude for that finer fee into the budget, and those numbers are decreasing steadily over time, you can make a powerful statement and tell a legislature, look, this finer fee stream is unreliable. It is not good for stable and fiscally responsible budgets because we see that the collection of this finer fee has decreased by over 50% over the last 5 years. Wouldn't it be better if we eliminated this finer fee revenue stream and we replaced it with revenue that we know to be stable and reliable, like the general fund, so that you don't put at risk the operations, the staffing, the important programs that you want to make sure you can fund. But again, you can only tell that story if you're able to track down the revenue for a number of years and be able to see that revenue path for each year. And then another important thing that following the money helps us do is clarify who will versus who should care about the reform that you are trying to pass, either through the budget or standalone legislation. And so when you can track not only who is collecting the dollars from a particular finer fee, but also in which agency budget are those dollars going, and in which agency's budget are those dollars being used and spent, that will help you understand which agencies might be natural allies or ready to sign on to your campaign and help advocate for it with you versus which agencies might be more hesitant or nervous about eliminating a finer fee because it might eliminate an important source of funding in their budget. So take, for example, like a public defender fee. So if maybe the clerks are collecting the public defender fee and then they are sending it per statute to the Office of the Public Defender, and it's helping to subsidize the salaries of court-appointed attorneys. In that case, understandably, the Office of the Public Defender is probably going to be hesitant or nervous at first about the idea of getting rid of that revenue stream unless you do a lot of relationship building with them and clarifying that there is this alternative solution for other revenue that can come in and backfill or replace that revenue that they would lose from the public defender fee no longer being collected. But if that public defender fee gets collected by the courts, by the clerks, and then goes to the general fund, say, and it never goes into the Office of the Public Defender at all, in theory, the Office of the Public Defender should not care from a fiscal standpoint about the elimination of that public defender fee because it's not funding their budget to start with. And so sometimes this can take a little bit of investigation and following the money to understand who's actually receiving and using those dollars. And that will help you understand which agencies are more likely to be your allies versus your opponents, and who's going to need what sort of like strategy and relationship building and communication as you move through your campaign. So for all these reasons and many more, it's so important to follow money. So now we're going to turn to how and talk about some very concrete concepts and tips for how to go about tracking that revenue path so you can tell that revenue story about why this revenue source of fines and fees is a harmful one, not only to the people who the budget is meant to serve, but to the budget itself. And as we start off that work, I want to first spend some time talking about some kind of technical basics about how budgets are set up and how revenue is structured to help you think about the different basic steps where you should go first, second, third, to try and look for the finer fee revenue that you are particularly interested in following. So starting out with just a snapshot of what budgets are, Annual budgets are created at the beginning of each fiscal year at the state and the local level, so in cities and counties and states, and they contain a snapshot of all the different types of revenue, so all the different like flavors of revenue that will come in as public revenue for that budget over the entire next year. And then because both state and local budgets must be balanced, the budget is going to program an expected number of expenditures or dollars for spending that is equal to the expected or projected number of revenue dollars that the jurisdiction thinks it's going to bring in over the entire next year. And those balanced planned expenditures will cover operations, staffing, programming for all of the agencies and operations for the entire government jurisdiction for the entire next year. And I say all that to highlight the fact that the finer fee revenue that you're interested in looking at is going to be somewhere in the budget because it's a comprehensive snapshot for an entire year of all revenue and all expenditures. So budgets are really the place where you want to start your search for finer fee revenue. But the first step is figuring out which kinds of budget documents do you want to look at depending on what level of jurisdiction you think that your finer fee revenue you're interested in looking at is going into. And so this is where you want to be able to distinguish between whether the dollars collected from a particular finer fee are going into state budgets or local budgets or both. And this again can totally depend on how your court system is set up in your jurisdiction, whether it's super centralized and all dollars go immediately up to the state and then get reallocated out, or whether it's decentralized. So an example like New York, where you have a state budget where some fines and fees revenue flows, and then city and county budgets where other pieces of revenue flow, and then hyper-local town and village budgets. And sometimes, depending on what particular type of finer fee it is, where it is assessed and collected, it could stay at that hyper-local level, it could go up to the state level. It really just totally depends on how statute and the court systems are set up. And so the first thing you want to look for when you're starting your scavenger hunt for following the money is figuring out, do I want to be looking at state budget documents or local budget documents or both? Once you figure that out, then you can start to look at fund structure, and you want to try and figure out what funds are the dollars from your fines and fees going to. And you can think about funds as kind of like fiscal homes or fiscal addresses. For dollars, it's the way that revenue dollars get organized and expenditure dollars within a particular budget. And there are a few different common types of funds that I want to talk about today that are most relevant to fines and fees revenue, where you are most likely to find the dollars from the kinds of fines and fees that you are likely interested in tracking the money for. So I want to start out by talking about general fund, which exists in both state and local budgets. Sometimes it's called like general revenue, sometimes general fund. I've seen it called like corporate fund, but this is your big discretionary pot of money that contains most of your general taxes. So this is like your income tax, your property tax, your sales tax. Some fines and fees revenue will go into the general fund, other miscellaneous licenses, fines, fees, etc. And once a dollar goes into the general fund, it loses its individual flavor of money, and it just becomes one of the general fund dollars. And all of these dollars put together make up this big discretionary pot that usually makes up a majority of the way that all agencies and operations and staffing across the entire jurisdiction get funded for the year. And lawmakers have a huge level of discretion about how to allocate this pot. So they can kind of put general fund wherever they want. And when it comes to budget development time, legislators are making a bunch of trade-offs about which agencies and priorities and programs and new initiatives do they think are most priority in order to allocate that fixed amount of general fund. Something important to know about if a finer fee dollar goes into the general fund. In one sense, it makes it harder to track because, again, once a dollar goes into the general fund, it loses its individual label, as, for example, if you're looking at a public defender fee, once that dollar goes into the general fund, it's no longer a public defender fee dollar. It is just a general fund dollar. And where that becomes tricky in terms of tracking revenue is if you have a department, say the Office of the Public Defender, that is majority funded with general fund. So say it's like 95% funded by general fund. And you know that that public defender fee comes into the general fund. You cannot directly say still, oh, these public defender fees are funding salaries in the office of the public defender. You can't say that because all you know is that the public defender fee is coming into the general fund and it becomes a general fund dollar. And then there are a lot of general fund dollars that are funding the public defender's department. But you don't know if those are like public defender fees or property tax dollars or income tax dollars, because they're all the same now. They're all just part of the general fund. So that's where tracking can be kind of difficult, and it becomes important to look for revenue forecast documents that specifically call out general fund forecasts and kind of line item all the different sources that go into the general fund. This is unlike federal funds and special funds, which are set up to have more restrictions on what kind of money comes into the fund and then how those funds can be spent. And because there are more restrictions and eligibility rules set up for these funds, you can better track and trace not only when that dollar is coming in, where it lives, but also where it's going and how it's used. So federal funds obviously are dollars that are coming in from the federal government to implement at the state or local level, federal mandated or created programs. Versus special funds are usually funds that are set up at the discretion of that jurisdiction's lawmakers, and they are designated for a particular type of revenue coming in from that jurisdiction, and they are meant for a specific type of expenditure. And so going back to our example of the public defender fee, if statutes set up a special fund for the public defender fee, which like could be called the public defender fee fund, it could be called just like the court fund, it could be called the attorney fund, they can call it whatever they want, but in statute, there will be rules around that says money from specifically this public defender fee goes into this fund, and any other funds of types of revenue if they want to go also into that fund. And then there will usually be a designation around what kind of expenditures are eligible for use from that fund. And so in that way, you can more specifically often track the fines and fees dollars that go into special funds. Those are the types of funds that I talked about for the state budget levels. You can see on the local budgets below, I also added a box for state or intergovernmental funds. This is just to highlight the fact that sometimes fines and fee revenue can move in between state and local budgets. Say if it's first deposited at the state level, and then there's a legal body that then appropriates or transfers out pieces of that revenue back out to local budgets and local jurisdictions. That may come through in local budgets and show up as like a state transfer revenue line or an intergovernmental transfer revenue line. Just something to be cognizant of if you are looking through both state and local budget documents to make sure that you're not counting the same revenue stream twice. Okay, so now that we've gotten, actually I'm going to check and see if there are any questions about that technical those technical terms. Looking for general, so someone asked if we're looking for general fund forecast documents, what are those usually called and where would we find them? We're going to tackle that in about 2 slides, but they do exist in almost every jurisdiction, state or local that I know of. So they are really good resources and something we're going to explicitly talk about soon. Okay, so now we're going to move from the why to the really concrete how for following the money, and that we've gotten some of the technical basics out of the way. And I'm going to talk you through some very concrete real world tips for doing this scavenger hunt of tracking down the fines and fee revenue that I often use in my technical assistance projects when I'm working with different state or local jurisdiction advocate groups to try and find a particular fine or fee. And the first thing that I always do is I start with statute. And so as we talked about before, looking at funds and trying to track down the fund where your fine or fee is being collected and held and distributed is essential to kind of figuring out where it is and that tracking process. And usually statute is what sets up those funds and sets up the designation for which funds a fine or fee is going into. So as you look through statute, you probably want to start with the statute that describes all the specifics around collection and distribution of the fine or fee that you're interested in. And you want to look for things like what level of jurisdiction is the money meant to go to? Oftentimes the basics of statute will tell you that, so you know whether it'll be looking at local budgets or state budget documents. It'll also hopefully tell you the names of the funds that the dollars are meant to go into and the rules around those funds. So eligibility rules around how those funds can be spent, which can also help illuminate that revenue path to a great extent. Once you find the name of the funds from that first section of statute, you can then go and you can look for a statute that sets up a particular fund. And in that separate part of statute, hopefully you'll get even more context and information about the fund that can clue you in even more to more detail about the revenue path. It's also good to look for the name of the collecting agency. And remember that the agency that collects the dollars may not be the same as the agency where the dollars are actually going. So even if like the courts are collecting dollars, they may go to, one or two or three or five different agencies. And that makes a difference, again, on who feels the impact if the revenue from that fines and fees go away because of a fee elimination campaign. And then one last thing that's really helpful to look for when you're doing a statute search is to check for any notes about the timeline for appropriation of the fund. In budgets, often funds are appropriated, which means legally authorized on an annual basis. And at the end of that fiscal year for that budget, sometimes a fund can be called what's called reverting, which means if there's dollars of revenue in that fund that have been collected but have not been spent, so they're just sitting there as fund balance, if a fund is a reverting fund, sometimes it will take those dollars and it will automatically scoop them out of that special fund, if it's in a special fund, and it will send them back to the general fund, where it just becomes part again of that huge discretionary pot of money that lawmakers can then decide to allocate however they want. Sometimes, though, with special funds, the appropriation and the fund itself will be non-reverting, and the appropriation might be continuing, which would mean that the fund balance that builds up is just allowed to hang out in that special fund and be used in future years, or not used at all. And this is something that's really helpful to look for. And then if you find a fund that's non-reverting, to look for information about fund balance for, because if there's a bunch of fund balance that has built up in a fund, that creates a really powerful argument and a really interesting piece of the revenue path story where you can tell legislators, like, look, this is clearly not a significant source of revenue for the budget, and the sky clearly isn't going to fall if we get rid of it, because look at how much money has been built up from these collections that is just sitting here. Meanwhile, it's continuing to have devastating impacts for the people that have had to pay this money, and nothing's actually happening with it. And in fact, if we eliminate this finer fee revenue stream, we can use this unspent fund balance that has built up over the next few years to help deal with replacing the revenue. So we don't even have to worry about like a general impact or finding more general fund to replace it for a few years down the road. So that can be an important and helpful thing to look for. After you see what you can find from statute, sometimes you'll find a ton, sometimes you'll not find very much. I tend to, as I'm going through statute and looking for these kind of keywords, I just have a list, like a sheet of paper next to me, and I start making lists of helpful like references that I find and pieces of information that I find. And I use that to then do a Google search to expand sort of any sort of background knowledge or context I can get about the fund, about the fee, about the agency that is holding and using the fee. And that Google search can kind of build and illuminate further, again, this overall revenue path story that we're trying to create. So as you're doing a Google search, some helpful, just like very concrete, very basic search terms you can use at the very basic level. You can search the finer fee name plus the jurisdiction name and just see what pops up. If you're searching for kind of more budget heavy references and documents, you can try some very budget specific keywords such as revenue forecast, budget book, budgeted revenue, and we'll talk on the next slide about what kind of hits might come up from that search. You can also try searching the name of the fund that you found is the place where the fines and fees are being deposited, and the word revenue, and see if maybe like reports come up that may be overall fund balance reports that might include the particular fund you're interested in. And then you can try the name of the agency that you know is collecting or using the funds, click on the word reports. Usually you'll get a series of different reports on lots of different topics and a combination of like annual reports and audits that every agency tends to have on their website. And you can kind of just skim through those and say, not even is there one that's like finer fee specific, because that's probably pretty unlikely, but is there one that makes reference to revenue or goes over like how the agency is funded and how the agency operates? And you might find what you're looking for, your finer fee information, as like one of hundreds of lines or one mention in, multiple dozens of paragraphs, but it might be exactly the information you need. So as you're doing these search terms, you may see a number of different types of documents come up. And I'm just going to go over some of the most common ones and talk about how each one might be useful to your search. And again, filling in this revenue path story. The first thing that often comes up for me when I'm doing these Google searches is news article and advocacy organization reports about the finer fee that I'm interested in tracking. And these are really, really helpful, not only to build overall context and understanding of how this fee fits into overall government operations, like who's collecting it, who's administering it, how it's used, but often there can be mentions, even if there's not like raw data in there that tells me, that like brings me to exactly the spot where the money is being held and collected and tells me how much is being held and collected. There's often references to fiscal numbers that can give me ideas about where to look next. So for example, in a news article or a report, it might make a mention of like, and when talking about how destructive and damaging this fee is to communities, you might say, and like the average assessment was X amount per person per year. If I see something like that, that's a statistic that sort of sets an alarm bell off in my head that says, okay, if they're able to find that average number, that means the data exists somewhere. And so then what I do is I always immediately look for a citation on a news article or its reports. And often you'll find a citation that will lead you to somewhere that gets you closer to government issued reports, which is really where you want to go at the end, is like your end game to get to the raw data that will give you the numbers for the precise tracking down of the fine and fee revenue that you're really looking for at the end of the day. And so often my search is like a series of, I find a news article and there's a citation there, and then it takes me to this advocacy report, and then I find a citation there, and it takes me to this department webpage, and it takes me to this like obscure report I never would have looked at before, but lo and behold, there's the data I was looking for. So that can be just really helpful to go through and take notes on and follow citations wherever you can. If there's not citations there, you can of course always reach out to the author of the news article or the advocacy group that published the report and see if you can informally, again, get that connection to other sources that may take you to that raw data. Budget books. So I mentioned some budget heavy keywords for your Google search on the previous slide. And if you have watched our previous webinar on how to read a budget book, you'll know that I love budget books for the immense amount of information that is contained within them. And they can be really, really helpful tools for tracking down fine and fee revenue. So if you haven't watched that episode and you want to know more about budget books, we go way more into depth in it in that episode. But just a real quick general overview. The budget book is usually produced alongside the publishing of a governor or a mayor's proposed budget, which is the point when the executive office comes out with a balanced proposed budget, and then the legislature reviews, amends, and finalizes that budget for the next fiscal year. And these budget books can be hundreds of pages long, but usually the first half of budget books contain some sort of general revenue overview. And sometimes, if you're lucky there, they might mention fines or fee revenue that you're interested in as like something that has changed since last year, a driver of revenue growth or a driver of revenue decrease, or they might include tables of major revenue sources amongst which one might be fine or fee revenue. So that's a good place to check. If you don't find what you're looking for in a revenue overview section, you can also check out the agency by agency section that is included in most budget books, where agencies will highlight their general operations and then any specific funding initiatives that are different from last year that they're trying to put in this new budget. And there too, sometimes agencies will have an overview of like how they're funded and go through different sources of revenue. Sometimes they won't. Sometimes if you're lucky, like for example, the state of Michigan has this great formatting where they go through all of the major initiatives that are in a particular budget division. And then for each one of those initiatives that has a cost, like you have to spend money on, they include a note about what source is used to fund that initiative. And so like by looking at that, you can tell like which of the Department of Corrections initiatives are funded by medical copays versus which are funded by general fund. Not all budget books are that specific, but again, check yours out, see what it has, see what might be useful. And then at the back of budget books, there are usually sometimes very long appendices that have very technical, very long tables that can be difficult to read. But if you find the right tables, it can be incredibly valuable. So in some budget books, for example, you may see long lists of information about all the different special funds that are in a particular budget. And if you know that the fine and fee revenue you're interested goes into a particular special fund, you can look and try and find the reporting on that fund in the appendix. So don't sleep on the appendix either, even though it can be like hard to get through at times. Legislative reports and hearing materials are also really helpful documents that can be really useful to you. And these are particularly relevant or published at the point when the proposed budget and the budget books have come out and the legislature is about to review the budget and make any amendments they want to make before finalizing it. And it's at that point that the legislature almost always has a budget committee or finance committee who calls different hearings and briefings of every single department so that they understand what's going on in each agency's department's budgets, and they can ask all the questions they want to make sure they're not missing anything big in the proposed budgets themselves. And as a part of that, often agencies have to provide either written responses and or verbal responses through a hearing to specific questions that legislators on the budget committee have. As well as provide just a general overview of what's going on in their budget for the next year. And so either listening to those hearings or reading the written responses from departments can be a good way to, again, scan, use keyword search to see if you can find any mention of the type of fine or fee revenue that you're interested in. Also, if you're planning ahead enough if you're planning ahead of time enough, and if you have partners and allies in the legislature, particularly who are influential to or on budget committees themselves, you could potentially ask a legislator partner to ask a question of departments to be presented upon or to be responded in writing specifically about your fines and fee revenue. Like, this is a really good time to do that, because reviewing the budget means, like, I don't know, everything's on the table for discussion about all the different revenue sources and all the different expenditure plans that are going into that budget. So if you do have a way to sort of like get access to asking a question of departments in those hearings and briefings are usually recorded, and they are usually public, and they usually have some sort of public materials that go along with them. So they can be really good places to either try and like insert your question about fines and fees revenue to hopefully get some good data, or just look to see if that data might already be there through the materials that exist. And then a last section of documents that may come up is agency issued reports and audits. And so for the agencies that are collecting the dollars you're interested in or using the dollars you're interested in, you may want to, again, look on their page, look for all the reports that they put out every year, look at their annual reports. Sometimes those go into enough detail to discuss fines and fee revenue, a lot of times not. Sometimes there will be topic-specific audits that are on the report's web pages. Sometimes there will just be like an annual audit. Those are always worth checking out. To the question earlier about general fund forecast documents, those are not usually presented by a particular agency. Sometimes it'll be like the Department of Revenue, but more often I found it to be like a central body, sometimes it's a fiscal office within the legislature. Sometimes it's like a commission that's built. Sometimes it's the governor or the mayor's executive budget office. And so once you pinpoint who the body or office in charge is, who the office or body is who is in charge of producing that general fund report, that's a great place to look. Often revenue reports are updated quarterly to update those revenue forecasts and say like, okay, economic conditions have changed. Here's what we now think about revenue. And often you'll get a line item detail about all the different fines or all the different types of sources that go into the general fund. So although it's hard to track after it's already in there, these general fund revenue forecasts can be a great way to track which dollars are going in. And sometimes you can see that level of detail of general fund or of fines and fees in the general fund that you're looking for. Okay. So now we're going to move into examples to talk about how this all plays out. And I'm going to talk for just a few minutes about some of the technical work that I did in these types of searches in New York. And then I'm going to pass it over to Antonia on our FFJC team, who is our New York State Director, and is going to talk to you about how this work played into overall strategy for New York's campaign called No Price on Justice, which is an effort to end mandatory court fees that are assessed on all convictions in the state of New York at the most local levels all the way up to the highest state level. And caveat that I joined FFJC about a year ago. This campaign has been running for several years. And so while I was not present for those earlier years, it's my understanding that the goal to eliminate these court fees, one of the major obstacles at the very beginning that has persisted, is trying to understand the full fiscal impact of what that would mean for the budget. How much revenue would actually be lost, because how much revenue is actually being collected currently from mandatory court fees every year. And at one point, a couple of years ago, the Senate Fiscal Office put out this like really big, like I think almost like $500 million number as the fiscal note, as the price point, which is a really hard obstacle to overcome. And the coalition, the No Price on Justice Coalition, knew that this was not a reasonable or precise estimate, but without an alternative fiscal point, without the alternative ability to track the fines and fee revenue and say, no, it's actually this much, it's hard to have that discussion. It's hard to have that conversation with the folks who wrote the fiscal note, or to convince legislators that, no, we actually think it's going to be lower. And so I know that last year, the coalition was able to, through a FOIA request, get a partially comprehensive data set from the courts that showed lists of convictions and then corresponding court fees and imposed and collected, that helped them create an analysis that started to hone in on that fiscal point, which was way, way, way less than 500 million. But that analysis still had to rely on certain assumptions because the data set that we got was not fully comprehensive. And so there were still many question marks around where all these dollars were going, because we knew they were going to many different places at both the state and the local levels, and many different funds within that. And so when I joined the team, one of my primary projects over the last year has been to dig into all the different budget and finance resources I can to try and hone in as precisely as we can on following that revenue and understanding the full revenue path, and therefore the full revenue estimate of what the impact would be if all of these court fees were eliminated. And so I did many of the same things that I just talked to you all about. I read statute and I did Google searches. I was really lucky in joining a team and a coalition campaign that had already been running and doing incredible work for several years. And so there was a lot of existing advocacy campaign materials and information that I was able to read to understand the basic revenue flow. And I just literally, I went through all those search terms that I just highlighted with you all. And as I would read each new news article or each new advocacy material or fact sheet, I would just jot down mentions of funds, mentions of dollar numbers that I could find, click on citations from all of these different reports to get as close as I could to government issued raw data. And a fund that kept coming up over and over was this fund called the Criminal Justice Improvement Account, or the CJIA, which seemed to be one of the biggest places where most of the money based on statute was flowing into. And so then I accompanied that Google search of just sort of what was out there on the web with a search of statute, making sure I was looking both at statute that provided designations and restrictions around the fine and fee collection process itself, as well as statute around the funds that were set up to hold those fines and fees. And that helped me find additional references to the money flow and start to, again, fill in more and more pieces of that revenue flow map. So I'm going to show you one of the pieces of statute that I looked at. This is the piece, as you can see in Section 1 of New York Code, that sets up the Criminal Justice Improvement Account Fund specifically to hold court fees revenue that comes into the state of New York. And so the second section here tells me all of the different kinds of money that are allowed to come into this special fund. And so you see like Section 60.35 of the penal law. And then down below, you see Section 168B of the corrections law. And so what that allowed me to do was to go and check all of those different sections of statute to make sure that they were all referring to court fees that I already knew about that were part of this campaign to eliminate, that there were no other major sources of revenue that were coming into this fund that might sort of muddy the picture of what was happening to these dollars that I could find through reports on the fund itself. And it didn't seem that like there were. So that was good news for me, because then I knew if I could find reporting on the fund itself, that would basically reflect what was happening in terms of tracking the actual revenue for the court fees very specifically. And then the third section here talks about what the funds can be used for. And this was really useful too, because it told me that the primary use for these funds seemed to be only operations for the Office of Victim Services and victim services overall. And so what that allowed me to do was figure out that I should go to the webpage of the Office of Victim Services and I should read their reports and see what I could find about how they were funded and how they might be using fine and fee revenue and to what extent that office and those programs were dependent on court fees in order to continue their operations, so I could understand what the impact of elimination would be. So with all of that and with all the Google searching I did, I was able to stack up like quite a long list of just like references to funds and names and things and numbers. And it started to get overwhelming as just like a list on paper. So what I did, and like I'm a visual learner, so this may work for some, but not others, but I wanted to show you like what it looks like for me in case you want to try it, is I just mapped it out for myself. I made a literal revenue map of everything I knew about where court fees money went. And I'm showing this to you just as an example. It is internal, it is a draft, it is nothing we ever published or used externally. It was just so I could organize all the different pieces of information I was finding about tracking the fines and fee revenue, and then hopefully figure out sort of like a comprehensive picture that would let us hone in on that price impact. And so this is what it looked like for me. Again, I know the words are really small. Don't worry about reading the words. What I really want you to just take note of is the fact that I kind of lined up on alongside different parts of the page, the different types of funds that I knew funded these victim services programs, which you can see in orange at the bottom. So there's like general fund on one side of the page, and then there's special revenue funds, particularly that criminal justice improvement account. And then there's also federal funds. And what this allowed me to do is start attaching the specific numbers I found to like the places where the numbers were going. And it helped me kind of get a picture of like, to what extent would it be a problem for victim services programs versus other programs if that particular revenue stream that went to the Criminal Justice Improvement Fund and then to victim services programs was no longer there. Would there be other sources to support it? And like, what would that mean for the overall operations of this particular section of the government and the budget? And that ended up being very helpful in helping me know that the sky won't fall because there were many different sources that were funding these programs, but also helping me know that Criminal Justice Improvement Fund, that CJIA, was really the fund I wanted to hone in on because it was really where so many of the arrows were starting to point and then flow from. And with that, I went back and I researched all my budget documents. And what I ended up finding was at the back of New York's budget book, which is called their Executive Financial Plan, I found this list of all special funds, and I found a line for the Criminal Justice Improvement Fund. And it provided a whole host of very important information about that fund, which helped me further really hone in on and tell the story of the revenue path, particularly this column here, which shows miscellaneous receipts. Because I knew from statute that court fees were the primary source of money coming into this fund, I could consider receipts into the fund to mean the same thing as like court fees collected. And so I was able to see in fiscal 2023, $20.4 million of court fees were collected into this fund. And that was a very powerful find. What I did after that is I thought, wouldn't it be nice if I could know whether that is like a unique year, whether that's a relatively lot or little amount of money for this fund. And so what I ended up doing is I looked through the same reports in the same budget book for the 4 years prior so that I could get a 5-year view. And that let me set up the data and look for trends. And it let me come up with some really powerful talking points that we ended up using in the campaign this year to talk to legislators about why it would be a good thing overall for the government and the budget to get rid of this of this court fee revenue stream. So one important thing we found was that over the last 5 years, there was a 49% decline in how much money was going into the fund every single year. And that tells me, again, this is an unreliable revenue stream. Wouldn't it be better if we replaced it with something like general fund that is stable and reliable and you know it's going to be there and it won't put operations at risk? Another thing we found is that the report I was looking at gave us not only what was projected to come in for the next year, but it also told us what were the actuals, what actually came in at the end of the day for previous years. And that was a really interesting comparison because it showed me that a little under half of what was projected or expected in fiscal 23 was actually collected. And that, again, highlights how unreliable this revenue stream is, because the government's depending on these dollars to come in to fund these operations, because funds and budgets must be balanced, but that money isn't actually coming in. And that's not a surprise to those of us who are fines and fee advocate folks, because who are fines and fee reform advocate folks, because we know that inability to pay means collections are often a lot lower than what's expected or what's imposed. And then a last bullet point that we were able to get from the report was about how much fund balance was building up. And again, this just kind of proved the point that the money wasn't even all being used in the first place. So of course, we shouldn't care that much about eliminating it because it's just sitting there right now with an average closing fund balance of $19 million. So all these points put together, again, help to build the story of what's going on with this revenue, where it's going, why it's not good for the government, and why it will be okay to eliminate it. We were also able to use this average $27 million collected to come up with a low range for our own fiscal estimate that we then were able to use to kind of counter that really high $500 million number, and start to get a little bit more headway with conversations with folks in the government and in these offices to try and reach a actual understanding of what the actual revenue impact will be. And at this point, I'm going to hand it off to Antonia Jeffrey, our New York State Director, to talk a little bit more about how all this kind of technical work played into overall campaign strategy and messaging for the campaign.
Thanks, Lillian, and hi, everyone. I'm happy to be here to talk a little bit about how following the money made a big difference in our campaign. As Lillian mentioned, I'm the New York State Director, and I'm also, FFJC is one of the steering committee members of the No Price on Justice Coalition, which has been in place since 2020. First, I'll say that how did we even get to the point where we wanted to use this approach of digging deeper into the numbers is pretty much what Lillian mentioned, which is that we had gotten to a point where there was a consensus on the policy to some extent in the legislature, and requests from different legislators, both who wanted to support the bill and for those who just wanted to understand a little bit more for where is this money going? How much is it actually? Because we weren't armed with that information. We had a lot of anecdotal information. We also was able to point to some national surveys, research from other states, but we didn't have anything that was specific to New York. So armed with the fiscal note that Lillian put together that included all of the things that she just mentioned, we knew which meetings were most meaningful to happen. From the agency side, it was anyone who receives funding from the fees that we were looking to eliminate. That would be the Office of Victim Services, Indigent Legal Services, and then we also looked to anyone who's supposed to handle the money, which would be the Office of Court Administration, Department of Criminal Justice Services, or DCJS, and the Office of the State Comptroller. And then from the government side, we talked with the finance committees in each chamber. That's the Senate Finance Committee and the Assembly Ways and Means Committee, and also try to have meetings with the governor's budget folks. And what we did in these meetings was contextualize the number that we came up with in the fiscal note to tell the story of why fee elimination was right, both for the communities that are most faced with this impending debt that's really just a revolving circle of debt that never leaves, and also for the health of the budget and for the government itself. I would say that in contextualizing that number, we had to debunk what everyone thought was happening with fines and fees revenue, that it was bringing in this large amount of money that we wouldn't be able to risk losing, which we were able to point to some of those points that Lillian highlighted as key takeaways from the research that shows the diminishing receipts coming into the criminal justice improvement account, and also the low collection rates that were happening amongst the fees that made it better to eliminate the fees than to keep them and have important services funded from an unsustainable funding source. So who did we speak to, and which of the messages really resonated? There were a lot of great parts of the analysis that showed where the money goes, and it was important to some of our key targets in the legislature, the people who have a lot of influence over their respective members and each chamber about what to do when it comes to something that has a fiscal note. Also, there are a number of members that kind of like focus a lot of their legislation on victim services. And so knowing that a portion of the revenue coming in would go to victim services was a real stumbling block to having their support. But demonstrating, one, that the amount of money that fines and fees are bringing into that portion of the budget is very small. And then even within that small number, not much is collected. And so we were able to use this information to get victim services organizations also involved in our campaign, who really felt strongly that their funding sources needed to be stable, come from a much more stable place, like the general fund. And then for different legislators, different points in our analysis stood out. The outstanding debt over time that just continued to linger was one of them, the diminishing receipts, as we mentioned before. And then also, there were members who cared a lot about the fact that the fees used to be waivable, but now are mandatory, which really spoke to the kind of like the cycle of how now the fees manifest in communities, have officers being used as armed debt collectors rather than working on actual public safety, was something that was really valuable to our campaign. But we also had to defend the fiscal analysis against pushback. Two of the places that we encountered some pushback was from New York City, which is obviously the largest city in New York State, who brought to our attention the amount of revenue that's collected in the parking context around fee revenue, which is information that we did not have and that we were transparent about in the fiscal analysis, but was used as a way of pushing back to say that these fees should not be eliminated. And then also the Office of Court Administration, when asked by the legislature, how much will this actually cost? This is what Lillian alluded to earlier, and they gave that really big $500 million number. When we really got into it, we realized that they were combining fines, fees, and forfeiture into a bucket of what was coming in, but they were not saying that. It's not reported in a way that is split. So they didn't want to account for how much they believed fees were. They just presented the entire bucket and said, this is what we would be facing, possibly losing, which was, again, a very uphill battle to fight. But having someone like Lillian and this fiscal analysis, we were able to go into those conversations with a little bit more detail than what we had been before. And the last piece I want to mention is, where does the advocacy go when following the money comes to a halt? Because there are still questions that we were unable to answer. There's local, like the Justice Fund that's done on the local level. We didn't have that information. We also didn't have the information around the New York City parking tickets. So from then, I think the place that the advocacy goes first is keeping the dialogue as open as possible. We have someone who's able to speak the budget language from the government side. So offering Lillian as a resource to help them dig through the numbers, kept the dialogue open, and made it a more collaborative process rather than us actually just trying to succeed in this campaign that we were building. Also, continuing education. Lillian revealed a lot of things to us in the research process that even the legislatures didn't know, that the Senate finance folks who have been working on this for years also didn't know. And then also the last thing that I want to mention is that following the money creates a narrative about the way that the state government is using fines and fees. So really honing in and telling that story is important. And also utilizing real life situations, because we have a lot of folks in our campaign that are directly impacted by predatory court fees. So combining the narrative that we've been able to create by following the money with their real life experiences can really make a difference in our campaign. And we made it pretty far into the budget process, really until the last week, when it was determined that there just wasn't enough information. They weren't comfortable enough with moving forward this year. But armed with this information, we have completely transformed the relationship that we have with the legislature, with the relevant committees, and with the government agencies in order to figure out how we can do this in a way that is equitable. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Lillian to include anything that I may have forgotten.
Thank you, Antonia. Really appreciate your expertise and perspective there as sort of one of the people who was leading this campaign, how all those technical pieces and those fiscal numbers really plays into that overall messaging and campaign strategy work that, as she said, is ongoing. This is where we want to end the presentation with sort of that real world example. And I know we're at time, so totally fine if you have to drop off the webinar. Again, we're recording all the way to the end. So if you want to catch this last Q&A section, you can check out the recording later. But I want to at least address two questions that I see in the Q&A. The first one being a question about uses of public records requests to figure out pieces that you're not able to find in public budget documents, and how to word those ways and how to word those requests in a way that will circumvent evasion by local agencies being asked. Thanks for raising this question. It's a really good one. Throughout this webinar, I've been talking about using Google searches and references and citations and all the documents you can find to build the revenue path story and map it out for yourself. There may very well be pieces of that story that are still blank or missing because the public data just isn't there. No matter how much you search for it, it just isn't showing up in any public reports. That is where public records requests can become really useful. And your search can be really useful for honing in on very narrowly exactly which data do you not have. And so by sort of filtering out everything you can find, you can give yourself very specific points and questions of what types of records you want to request in your public record requests. And you want to be very specific in that terminology. So like, you can even refer to specific types of documents. So when I have done records requests before for fines and fee revenue, I have specifically said that the Office of Budget and Management uses in their general fund revenue forecast. So I do research on which office does the revenue forecast, and then I know exactly who to send it to, so that they can't say, oh, well, we're not the custodians of this record, because I can say like, yes, you are, because I see that you produce this report every year. So I want to get like the data and the records behind this big aggregate number that you have. There's also one other question here about, are there any good resources for understanding the costs of collection? It's interesting that collecting agencies don't always retain the revenue, so fines and fees could have very different fiscal impacts on collecting versus receiving agencies. Also, really good point and a really good question. The cost of collection, I feel like, could be a whole other webinar in itself, but it is absolutely true that for most, if not all jurisdictions, the cost of trying to collect on fines and fees, which are such an inefficient revenue source, often offset it by a huge amount, the revenue loss that you feel from no longer collecting the dollars. Unfortunately, that data is very hard to track down. I would say often harder than even tracking down the fines and fees like revenue data itself. There is a great Brennan Center report that I am forgetting the name of. Maybe our comms team can put in the chat if our comms team remembers the name of it or the link to it. But they do kind of a case study of a few different states and counties that show that the cost of collection of fines and fees can be almost, and in some cases more than, the collective revenue that you gain from collecting these fines and fees from people. And so it's a great example to hold up, and there will be times at which there are opportunities to push legislators or people writing a fiscal note to try and include those costs of correction in the fiscal note and show that offset that lowers the overall like revenue loss impact that fines and fees reform will have. But it's not always possible just because of the difficulty in tracking down who exactly is doing the work to try and collect, exactly how much time. If they free up that time, is that like a net actual savings of pay, or are they just spending their like salary dollars doing other things? So probably a topic for another webinar, but a really good thing to take into account when you're trying to build that overall picture of fiscal impact. I think that's all the Q&As we have, all I see on the Q&A for now. So just a reminder that this webinar has been recorded. You can go back and check the recording anytime. And a reminder to the point that Antonia made about how, with experience that I have working in government offices previously, I was able to sort of like bring that perspective to the table. But this whole webinar, we've been talking about ways to research fines and fees revenue data, all really using public data, data that is accessible to everyone. And I am very passionate about making sure that everyone, no matter who you are, no matter how much interaction or no interaction you've ever had with budgets, you should be able to access public budget documents. You should be able to use them. So I do encourage you to do the scavenger hunt on your own. And really try and dig into understanding that full revenue path to maximize the effectiveness of advocacy campaigns that you may be working on. Thank you all for tuning in, and have a wonderful day.